Let's go live now to Dr. Andreas Krieg, Senior Lecturer at the School of Security Studies at King's College London. Hello to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's go through the complications. These negotiations, the truce was extended, but right at the very last minute. In your assessment, what could those complications be? Why does this process seem to be losing momentum?
I don't see it as losing any momentum, actually. It was always clear that this was a temporary truce, so extending it can only ever be done by 24 hours at a time. So it's about 10 prisoners roughly for 24 hours of truce, and then also for in exchange for further Palestinians being released from Israel. So every single day, both sides, particularly with Qatar in the middle as a mediator, both sides have to agree who's going to get freed from both Israel and from Hamas. And the issue here is, particularly on the Hamas side, is that a lot of the civilians are not held directly by the core of the group Hamas, but by branches and other groups in the wider network of Hamas. So they need to be found, they need to be accounted for, and then there needs to be a way, logistically, to get them out of wherever they are. So it's a logistical obstacle more than anything.
And of course, you mentioned there Qatar, which is playing a very important role, isn't it, as a mediator?
Absolutely. So nothing goes without Qatar. The Qataris have really embedded themselves very deeply in this diplomatic fabric, primarily about the hostages, and that's where most of the public attention globally goes to, in Qatar's role as to get the hostages out. But Qatar is also trying to decelerate the conflict. The Qataris have an interest in trying to extend this negotiation or mediation process for as long as possible, up to 20 days. They're quite confident. The US is backing them because the US also wants to decelerate and de-escalate the conflict, making sure that it doesn't go back to the escalation that we've seen in the early weeks of October. And at the same time, the Qataris are also quite instrumental in getting humanitarian aid in, and also speaking to the broader axis of resistance, if you will, particularly Iran, because obviously we're still on the knife's edge. There's still a possibility for this war to escalate in Lebanon and in Iraq, and also we've seen that escalation in Yemen. And we want to make sure that this doesn't happen. And again, Qatar has the channels that everyone needs to kind of speak to the Iranians in particular.
You mentioned the US there, of course. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is once again in the region. I think this is his third visit there since October the 7th. How significant is that? And how significant is his call today for saying, you know, the positive results that have come out from this truce, clearly wanting it to continue?
This is just testament to how good this diplomatic off-ramp has been working so far. I mean, we're only focusing on the hostages, and Netanyahu made it very clear yesterday that he wants to go back to war fighting after that. But there has been a lot of occasions where both sides could have cancelled the truce and continued fighting, and they didn't, which suggests both Israel and Hamas want to continue this current negotiation and contact going. There is trust on both sides to a certain extent, which is what the Americans wanted. The US is very interested in making sure the war kind of loses, kind of running its course and making sure that it doesn't go back to these levels of escalation. And I think there's the talk that came out today, I think what Blinken made very clear to the Israelis is that there is no stomach in Washington for the sort of death toll, the indiscriminate targeting that we've seen in the early weeks of the operation, and going now further towards to a more de-escalated, sort of a lot more limited operation where targeting is a lot more clear, where there are safe zones for civilians to go to and will be respected by the Israelis as well, where there's clear messaging. And also Israel has to come up with a strategic end game, and it has to be clear that this can actually be achieved. But if this truce gets extended for another couple of weeks, we might see a situation where at the end of it, we will actually not go back to full war fighting, but very targeted special forces operations with close air support. So there is an idea in America that this truce could lead, if extended to the very end of it, that it could lead to a diplomatic off-ramp, which is far bigger than the hostage release.
Just talking about the hostage release, I mean, obviously the people that we've seen so far released from Hamas, the women and children, does it become more complicated when we're talking about men being released, when we're talking about potential Israeli military being released? Does that add to the level of complication?
Absolutely. I think so. We have three phases. I mean, we're still in phase one, which is about civilians who are, or those that Hamas deems as being civilians. The problem here is that most of them are now no longer held by the core of Hamas. The second phase will include those that could be considered as military grade, sort of Israelis, men and women who could join, of military age and could join. And the third phase could also include those people who've been captured since operations started on the ground, particularly also some dead bodies that were captured by Hamas. And we know in the past that Hamas has used them as tokens as well to negotiate and bargain. But I see this next phase, 2 and 3, to be tied to a much bigger further release of Palestinian prisoners in Israel, of whom many are actually not just some violent dissidents, but absolute terrorists and people who've been in prison for quite a long time with quite a big reputation as well. So that will be very difficult for Israel to do. But that's why the countries are saying, take a day at a time, see how far we can go. If there's trust at the end, maybe there is something bigger that we can negotiate in the end.
Okay, Dr. Andreas Krieg, we really appreciate your time. Thank you.